Okay, hello, and welcome to this eSchool News webinar all about accessibility, how Microsoft solutions can help enable a more inclusive classroom. My name is Kevin Hogan. I am the editor-at-large for eSchool News, and I am happy you are joining us today for what I know will be a very insightful and important conversation. This event is brought to you by Microsoft. Microsoft's commitment to leveling the playing field with inclusive technology will empower you to change the game. When we are able to meet every student where they are, when we can give each of them the opportunity to grow and succeed regardless of their circumstances, we will change what's possible for children around the world. By providing all learners with access to innovative technology, quality education, and a support system of educators, mentors, and peers, we can be the generation that closes the achievement gap for good. Now, before we go to our conversation, I'd like to take a minute to go over some of the features of the platform that we're using for this webinar. The event is being recorded, so you don't have to worry about missing a thing. Within a few days, you'll receive an email message that contains a link to the recorded webinar, along with a PDF of the slides. Also, there's a chat function that you can launch by clicking on chat. Feel free to use this feature to contact someone from eSchool News team if you have a technical question. If you're using the desktop version, you can also use the Q&A. Either way, those questions will get to us and we can engage the panelists with them. And I really encourage the audience to do that. It really adds to the conversation and hopefully will help give you more insights and answers to issues that you might have. So with these housekeeping items out of the way, let's get started with our conversation. And first, just a brief introduction to our panelists. First, Sam Reich. After more than 10 years as a filmmaker, storyteller, and Walt Disney Imagineer, Sam moved north and spent the last 15 years bringing her passion for education and learning to Microsoft. As a director of marketing, she and her team support the mission of every student around the world, having what they need to succeed to achieve in school and in life. Inspired by her young twins, born small and premature, the mother and scientist was curious to understand every part of the way they learned, especially how they learn differently. Now, 21 years later, as more tools and technology emerge to support diverse learners, her twins are thriving, and so are many others. Sam is recognized as one of the top 10 most influential women in technology by Fast Company, and is one of the top 100 women in technology by TechFlash. She believes the intersection of technology and learning that's been accelerated by the pandemic will help bring more equity to education and help all students achieve more. Also with us today is Marie Martin. Marie is CEO of Alexandria's World. For over 15 years, Marie has been a global educator, trainer, facilitator, and instructional designer, working with educators, leaders, and a highly diverse group of students. She is a 3-time Teacher of the Year recipient for her work in the classroom. She has trained, coached, and mentored teachers on second language acquisition best practices and has continuously created inclusive classroom environments rooted in social and emotional learning. Within her last school district, Marie led school-wide social and emotional learning and project-based learning implementations. Marie is currently CEO of Alexandria's World, which is an education media company that provides culturally responsive curriculum and services. And ladies, thank you both so much for spending the time today to share your insights with us.
Good morning.
Good morning. So great to be here. It's such an exciting topic. I just could not be happier to be talking about it. By the way, I'm Sam. My pronouns are she, her. I am the person who works at Microsoft in marketing, and I'm so delighted to be here and tell you about a bunch of cool things that we have really that are all designed to support educators, because as we all know, the world is becoming more and more diverse, not just because of the pandemic, but just because, we're all different and we all need the tools to help us succeed. So I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled to be here with Marie as well.
Thank you. And I'm also very, very humbled to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to come and speak on this. I'm very passionate about really focusing on equity for all students, especially when it comes to their learning and education within the school system.
Well, again, thank you both. And I know we've had a little conversation before leading up to this, so we kept our powder dry in that. But we also came to the conclusion that as much as we're tired of talking about it, the pandemic is still unfortunately very much with us, and that I think, going forward in this conversation about accessibility and equity, we are going to have to continue to keep it within that context. Maybe we can get started really if we can dive into both of your histories a little bit more, and we'll use what I use as the BP versus the DP, right? So we have before the pandemic, and then now we have what we're enduring right now. Talk a little bit about your work in this area, and Marie, we'll start with you about where you started in this work, and then where you find your work as a result of the last 20 months in COVID-19.
Yeah, thank you so much again. I think I should probably start with my roles, right? Because I am a wife, I am a mother, a daughter, and caretaker of two wonderful elderly parents. I'm an educator and a change agent. And before the pandemic, I was teaching kindergarten within my school, as I had been doing the previous 4 years after moving back to California from overseas. And within this context is where I was working with a wonderful class of students, lovely kindergartners, where I loved to implement the social emotional learning framework, as well as project-based learning frameworks within my classroom, which is why I won Teacher of the Year several times. And that, of course, that spread out to teaching other teachers about these processes and leading school-wide implementation. I would say that right before COVID, and this is so awesome that you said what happened before COVID. I actually had a very challenging class in the midst of COVID, where I wouldn't even say a handful. I would say only a handful was okay. When I say okay, I mean the other students may have been dealing with trauma, may have been dealing with learning disabilities, or I had students of second language, and I don't call them second language, I actually call them biliterate in my class. It was a very challenging class and a very challenging year, and I was still working on them. During the pandemic, I actually, instead of trying to teach full class, I created choice boards throughout the week. My teaching partner, and I decided to go with projects and choice boards throughout the week, and they could earn badges for as many choices as they made. And so these choices some would be academic, some would be family focused. Where it, just go out and learn how to throw a baseball, and we would put several videos up for them. Or how do you make your bed? We were thinking maybe students would need to learn how to help their parents around the house. And what I did was I implemented one-to-one tutoring with my students. And what I found in this was a high level of personalization that I could do with each and every single student. And I opened up my class now, not just during the day, but I had a lot of essential workers in my class as well, parents, I should say. And I noticed that. And so I opened up my class in the evening as well. And I had time frames in the evening for those students who really needed work time outside of the normal work day, right? During the pandemic, my husband and I started training other teachers on how to do project-based learning through in a virtual classroom, and also how to do guided reading. We've done lots of trainings on guided reading as well, and making sure that students during this time frame have the best opportunity to use technology towards meeting their goals, their learning objectives. So that was my before and my during and my after.
Wow. So we're about 6 minutes in, and you just gave us an hour's worth of innovation as a result of using technology in a remote setup. So, Sam, talk a little bit from your perspective. I mean, again, with your years working on these tools, a lot of conversations I've had with people said, everyone looking for a glass half full or, silver linings. If the pandemic had struck 10 years ago, we would not have had the technologies or the bandwidth available to do a lot of the things that have been done when we did this great beta test, right, and the shift to remote. Talk a little bit about how you saw the tools that Marie just talked about, so amazing ways in which that was probably never intended, right? I mean, the pandemic was not maybe part of the mission statement when they were putting these tools together for educators.
Well, you know what? I'll tell you what. So the first thing really to recognize is that what Marie just told you is the story of a single educator going to extraordinary lengths to make sure that her students were supported. And, the reality is, we have amazing educators in our system, but we've overburdened them in the last almost 2 years to where even the most innovative, positive, technology literate teacher is challenged. And not only that, they have this distance, right, where, before, and I know this with my own kids, being a single mom raising twins, like just getting to a parent teacher conference for me was hard. 2 classes, everything was really hard, right? So the things that Marie's telling you that she's implemented, if every educator had access, if every educator had training, if every educator had the ability to be either self-supported or supported by their system, their leaders, right, we would be much further ahead. So, given that as a sort of a starting point, I think, the goal that we have at Microsoft is to really listen to what those educators are telling us that they need, how the configuration of their student body is changing, right? We know I did a piece of research last year where we talked to something like 600 educators across the US, found that in the average classroom in the US, average public school classroom, 3 to 4 different reading levels at grade 3 and 4, right? Probably somewhere around 50 to 60% of classrooms, each of those students have an IEP, right? And so how is one educator, without support, without tools, without a process, a way to do this, how would we in the world expect for them to be able to do the best for our students, right? It's not feasible. So what we're trying to do really is, as you all know, right, the pandemic hit and all of a sudden Teams became this thing, right? And I can tell you, to be very transparent, we weren't incredibly ready. Even we weren't ready. We had been developing this tool for a very long time. It has gotten so much better because of a lot of, frankly, user testing based on need. And that's all about listening to what educators and schools need and then trying to match those tools to those needs. And so, for instance, we're talking a lot about accessibility, right? So we have a tool that was developed 3.5 years ago, I want to say, called Immersive Reader. This is a tool that is cross-platform. It works in the browser. It's free. You can access it from almost anywhere, anytime, on almost any program. And what it does is helps kids with reading. It helps them decode language It gives them pictures sometimes when they need pictures to decode that language, whether they're a second language learner or maybe they're just like my daughter was in first grade and not really reading yet. So, we have these tools that can both destigmatize all of those things that we put into kids at a very early age about all the things that they can't do. And instead, we can kind of teach educators to use these tools that will help them help those students so that, like, my daughter in first grade doesn't think she was stupid. That stays with kids. And because we know that well-being and mental health and all of those things, especially in the last 20 months, are incredibly important, we built a lot of those tools in for kids. So, so I don't want to get too far down the tool path, but I think one of those silver linings that you're talking about is the fact that we've kind of shined a bright light on the kids that are not being supported, and why that's not fair. And when you look at the entire UC system this week announced that SATs are a thing of the past. That is a gigantic win for diversity and students everywhere, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, it does seem too, Marie, when you think back to March of 2020, everything went out the window with a renewed focus on just getting students reconnected, right? By hook or by crook. To give credit to the industry, Microsoft and others just kind of said, you know what, whatever we need to do, let's get it done. Curriculum lifted. So I mean, that was one big, massive push towards this idea of equal accessibility and digital equity. Do you see that sentiment staying now in your work with schools and with the industry?
Absolutely. When you just said that, it reminded me of watching Bettina Love, where she said, schools said that they didn't have food, but we can see that they clearly can feed students, right? And
right.
Said that they didn't have technology, but they found the technology for students that needed. And so it is about not necessarily what can we get from education? It is how can we create a space for everyone within our education system. And that means that we're looking at the whole child, not just, okay, what is your SAT score? What is your number? And it's really trying to quantify a human and a human life and their own experiences. And what we have found, even in the research that when I first joined SAM last year, we found that parents are trying to provide, and the school system can now provide, whole experiences for students that they didn't know before. And when we talk about teaching the whole child, we're talking about looking at their gifts. So many times, teachers look at what's wrong with the child, trying to create, something in a space for them to try to correct them, right? And in order to correct them, they have to get this test score, right? And they have to prove that they're great on this test in order to be validated or to get money for their school, right? Well, what we're seeing now, hold on, we can really take time to personalize. For students. Each student has their own gift and they have their own goals. And now we can use technology to reach out to families, bring them into our classrooms, and reach out to parents and have those parent conferences that Sam was talking about. That's something that is not leaving. Yeah. And we can use tools like Translator to efficiently translate what's going on in the classroom to parents and create goals with parents, co-create goals, not just say, okay, this is what I need your child to do to pass this test, right? Yeah. It is about, tell me what your goals are for your child, and I can see how I can support that in my classroom. And right. This is what I'm going to do in my classroom to support your goals. Now we have we have buy-in from the parents, we have buy-in from the teacher, and we have buy-in from that child. And that child is going to do their best. When we're talking about the inclusive classroom, it includes parents too. And I know we were going to stay, but I mean it is part of the classroom. That's one of the things that I worked on. And when we first contact parents, instead of telling them all the little naughty things kids do in class, we talk to them about their gifts. And how would they like for us to proceed in developing the gifts and talents of their children? And that is what's most important when we're talking about technology, when we're talking about curriculum, when we're just talking about being a part and being a team in the classroom.
Yeah, one of the big pictures things that you had mentioned before pandemic, you had the idea of IEPs and special education, where students would be called out for special needs. Now we're in this, every student, we should have this idea that every student has an IEP and they have these special. And Sam, the tools are there in order to accomplish giving every student an IEP, right? I mean, if you said that to a teacher before who has 40 kids and everyone has an IEP, their brain would probably explode. But because you can have one-to-ones, you can have teams meetings with parents at night that might take 7 minutes as opposed to 90 minutes, you might be able to provide these sort of services, right?
I just I get so excited when we have these conversations because and it's hard because I'm a person who works at Microsoft, but I've been a school board member, and I've been a single mom of 2 kids who have very different learning styles, very different needs. In fact, the only class that they were ever together in was 3rd grade. And it was like the dreamiest thing because all the assignments were the same. But I can tell you, the way that I can kind of describe this notion of personalization is sort of with a little bit of a personal story. Like I was saying, my kids were born early. Thankfully, I'm so blessed. They're doing great and didn't have any super huge challenges. But it was always sort of in the back of my mind, right? Like my daughter was a late reader. My son kind of has a little bit of, maybe a little bit of ADHD, like what's going on, and I was kind of a straight ahead public school kid in the Midwest. So, I had to kind of really start to think about this stuff that I always thought just kind of, we went to the public elementary school, to the middle school, to the high school, applied to college, and it was like pretty straightforward. My kids, presented very differently. So in high school, they ended up going to two different high schools. My daughter, who is very straight ahead, was very much like me, very disciplined, very focused. She's a ballet dancer. She went to the big public high school that was very rote. They're very highly regarded. She did well. Great. My son, and by the way, that school is, I think her graduating class was like 600 or 700 people. My son was not going to do well in that environment, right? Because he did need that sense of personalization. He needed not somebody to sit on top of him, but somebody who is going to hold him accountable so that he could learn to be accountable on his own. And the thing about Washington State was we had just gotten charter. And without getting into a big political conversation about charter, what was interesting is we had never had that before. And it was a new school. There was going to be a single class to start it with 100 kids. And he was one of those 100 kids. And when they came to us to tell us about the school, I was like, ooh, that sounds iffy. Like at best, that sounds iffy. I was having a conversation with the curriculum director, and I said, hey, all this stuff that you're talking about sounds great. Personal accountability, planning, being able to work at his own pace, destigmatizing tools. All of these things sound so amazing. By the way, my kid is not that self-starter. And he looked at me dead on and said, don't you want him to be? He's going to go to college someday. sure enough. And they both had these very different experiences, but both had the level of support that they needed to be able to be their best selves in an education setting, to not feel like they were the dumb one because they couldn't read the word of the day, to be encouraged, as Marie talks about, for their gifts. And by the way, nobody really needed to know that one of their gifts wasn't being able to have a really big vocabulary and pronounce words properly.
Right.
Because there were other great gifts. So we have tools now that can support that.
Yeah. From the educator perspective, Marie, talk about how you are able to have an equal platform for students across the classroom, or if we have people in the audience who are principals and you're thinking about an entire school, or maybe even a director of technology who's talking about an entire district, specifically maybe a district that might have some communities where some of the schools are underserved. Sometimes you have districts where the entire district is underserved. What do you think are the next steps for them? I mean, maybe we have seen this awareness now that there is technology available for everyone. I mean, once you get them the bandwidth right at home, I mean, that hasn't been solved yet, obviously, but we're working towards that. At least there's an understanding that there are students and teachers who still don't have access at home. But let's say we're going to work on those for the next year or so and get that. What will be the next biggest challenges for those educators to improve that accessibility to these Microsoft tools and other tools and services?
That is a great question, because it really does start with how the classroom is set up, the curriculum and pedagogy that is in place. And then on top of that, I think of it as like a pyramid, right? And at the tip of that is using technology to accelerate all that goodness, right? And so with my class specifically, I specifically worked on the culture of my classroom and the support systems within my classroom using social emotional learning strategies. I found that over the past year, as I've been talking with teachers a lot and interviewing some, we as teachers compartmentalize a lot. So it is English, and we're doing reading right now, and it is now time for math, and it's time for your PE. And within my classroom, if you were to come into my classroom, you would see that students were working on all different types of things at all different types of times. And it would possibly be surrounded by one focal point, one type of project. And when I'm pulling groups in order to help them with their reading so they can read better towards that project, let's say. If I'm pulling math students to target their weaknesses in order to strengthen them, and then I send them back into the classroom to continue their different projects or activities for the day. If the school came in and said, we need, next week is Red Ribbon Week, you need to start, can you pass these out and have the kids do this project? It was no problem for me. It wasn't an extra thing, because I would just set it out as an activity that they could do at their workstations. And after their workstations, or after their workstation, they could do a may do. So if they got finished early, for those early finishers, then they can just go ahead and go to a may do station that was already set up in my classroom. SEL was not an additional thing. It wasn't one lesson. This is my SEL. I've had student teachers tell me, this is my SEL lesson. I'm like, what is that? And they're like, social emotional learning. I said, I know what social emotional learning is, but what is a social emotional learning lesson? What is your planning for that? And so the plan really is having a space for students to conversate and dialogue about their day at the beginning of the day. Or if they're having a bad recess, the kids are coming in, they're fighting, and here you are, you're saying, hey, let's talk about this. What happened? And then you see the conflict, and then you help them work on the conflict right there. And it's just a part of it. Here's another thing, and I loved, Sam, how you talked about your twins and how they're totally different. And I've had twins before, and one set of twins came in, and the mom says, okay, well, this is the smart one, and this one, not so good. and it was a boy-girl twin group, and I was like, oh, okay. And then
let me guess, wait, the girl was ahead? Was the girl the smart one? Yeah.
And then at parent conference, I had to reintroduce herself to the twins. And I had to say, Mom, this is your reading, your literature, your writer, and this is your engineer. He is in my top math group. His mathematical concepts are way beyond, and his problem-solving knowledge is way beyond. And she's like, what? And I was like, yeah. Sometimes students who are way beyond in math are not the best readers. And you have to be aware of this as a teacher. Sometimes the top reader and writer, they're not the top student. That is just their gift. That's their skill. And some students are more skilled in science. And I love, Sam, how you talked about your daughter and how she's a ballet. And it made me think about my own daughter, because she would be called an intellectual in school because she does reading, math, okay. But I do have her in ballet class, and she's not the top dancer. As a matter of fact, my goal in COVID was to just get her out of COVID with a decent two-step so she could be okay. So that was like my goal as a parent for her. And I just remember at her first ballet recital, she fell. They were doing some improv kind of dancing. Now I think of what if her school only honored dancing, but she's a reader and a writer. How would that make me feel as a parent if the top thing that was respected was dancing, And it just so happens that when we're thinking as teachers, we can't think about, okay, this student isn't good at reading, blah, blah, blah. Well, there's tools out there to help us. There's tools like reading progress. There's tools like the immersive reader, just like Sam said. And with reading progress, I had a little boy, and he did not read well. And I might talk about him later. His story is a long story, but I love him to death. But he just wanted to read his video game. And he said, the only reason why I want to read is because I need to be able to read my video game. And so what did I do? I started pulling down information from his video game, because that's what he was interested in. And that goes to the personalization as well. And it also goes to the integration of how can we integrate all of these different things that the school wants us to do as educators and make it okay in our class. If you're not integrating knowledge, if you're not integrating skills, if you're not integrating technology in order to enhance all of the goodness you're doing in your classroom, then you're going to feel the stress and the weight of having to do everything.
You know what, Marie, like the integration point, Kevin, sorry to jump in, but
no, absolutely.
It's such a huge point. When I joined our team, and honestly, Microsoft we have a long heritage in education, but it really hasn't been until the last several years, really, maybe 3.5 years, where we started really making products for education and for educators, right? We'd always supported the education market. There are lots of schools that use, Windows and back office and all of those things. But it wasn't really until, honestly, for me, when I saw OneNote class notebook when I first joined the team, and I was like, so like it's OneNote. Right. And when you work in technology, you get a little jaded sometimes, for sure. But I was like, so it's OneNote, like so what? what was amazing about it was when the OneNote product manager was like, well, you don't understand. One of the biggest pain points for educators is that if I'm a kindergarten teacher, I'm using essentially all the same curriculum the next year. I might add or, kind of, change it somewhat, but I'm kind of using like a very similar playbook. I worked really hard on that playbook. So OneNote Class Notebook allowed them to just turn it over to the next year. So can you imagine not having to do all of that work from year to year and redoing the same thing over and over again, which is, right, like the definition of insanity. And now you have this tool that can help you do that really easily and really quickly. So, there's all of these things that have presented themselves as opportunities that, again, if we go back to I think you called it, BP, right? Like all of these same needs were there, right? We were working on acquiring the team at Flipgrid before the pandemic. And so there was this recognition. I mean, there was this incredible recognition of this amazing tool that gave students a voice. Right. And by the way, like, I mean, companies do all kinds of things. We acquired Minecraft. That was a different need and want and all of those things. I can tell you, like, Flipgrid was, we all as a team looked at that product and we went, holy moly, they have this incredibly active community, these incredibly innovative educators who are using this tool. And by the way, like there are hours and hours and hours of student voice being uploaded every minute of the day from around the world, right? Like that is such scale to be able to give students their own voice and be able to tell educators, parents, their own student community, how they think, who they are, like they're, I mean, you can imagine, like, I was the kid who sat in the front row and raised my hand a lot. It's probably why I do what I do. But like my very best friend when I was growing up was the kid who sat in the back and never wanted to raise her hand and like was really shy. And oh my gosh, she is now an educator who teaches other educators, right? So the valedictorian of our class, right? And she never spoke in class ever. So there are all of these incredible, I mean, I'm not Pollyanna in the sense that the job of educators right now isn't incredibly difficult. The job of leaders is incredibly difficult. How do leaders help their school culture, their school community, unless they have insights so they can understand how their community's feeling? How are they doing academically? And not to use those learnings to penalize or shame, but to use those insights to say, oh my gosh, wow, it's super clear that maybe in third grade, we're having a little bit of a challenge moving this class forward in these areas. Why is that, right? How do you, like teachers don't have a chance to like interview every student all the time. That's why we have tools. So, if we can give educators not just the tools, but the training and the impetus to use those tools well, to feel confident about how they use those tools, it will absolutely change the game. It will change the game for every student.
Well, it definitely seems that, the idea of professional development has been completely turned on its head, during the pandemic here, right? I mean, from the idea of, well, the first 3 days of school or 3 days before school, here are the 3 new tools that the district has acquired. You're going to learn how to use them, and then they just kind of go away. It really was the greatest beta test in ed tech history. On March 14th, everybody got their laptops if they had them. They went home and they signed up, and then it was like any and every tool that you could use to connect. And as you say, that social emotional learning aspect of to give a student's idea of feeling safe or to create things. Marie, talk a little bit about, you mentioned also before the role of parents. Now, I've written about education technology for almost 20 years. I probably wrote about 5 stories that talked about parents before the pandemic. Since then, as a parent myself, I've become a teaching assistant, and the rest of us all have become teaching assistants, have a new appreciation for teachers. But you also mentioned the essential workers in times where they couldn't be there with their kids when they're trying to teach. Talk a little bit about how that dynamic of professional development has changed and what it means, and maybe even talk a little bit about parental development as much as professional development.
Yeah, right. When you think about it, there has to be, well, let me go back. There's a lot there. So, number one, let me go back a little bit to what Sam was talking about interviewing students. Yeah, right? And giving students voice and choice and really making sure that their voice is promoted. Our world is flat now. And the use of technology means that I can contact anybody in this world and make sure that my students' voices are heard, right? But more than that, how can we use technology to reach out to parents, making sure we've already talked about that, right? But we can definitely use it for coaching, not only parents, but mostly teachers, because when it comes down to it, teachers have just now, those last adopters are now fully adopted now. They needed to have that training, and not only just training, but ongoing coaching, right? And so I feel that right now, the real bright spot is that from reading a lot of articles and talking to teachers, teachers are looking to not just adopt the newest and latest and even more. They're looking to get deeper into their knowledge of what they've learned so far. And the way to do that is to have ongoing job embedded coaching. In order to make this happen, that means that an administrator has to also make sure that there is a safe space for their teachers to thrive as well. So if you're thinking of that social emotional high anxiety classroom, how can we make the adoption and more adoption of technology low anxiety? That's the biggest thing. You want to make those kids low anxiety. And just like as an administrator, you're working and loving on those adults, right? And if you are working and loving on those adults, that means one, you're going to give them space and grace in order to try and innovate and do new things, and give them the space and room, and then sit and reflect with them, dialogue with them, having informal and formal channels of communication, which not only teams can do, right? But also a Flipgrid can do, having those ongoing open conversations and discussions back and forth. Or maybe a teacher could Flipgrid their classroom and think about and discuss and reflect on that, and have other people discuss and reflect on their classrooms, right? Yeah. And that just makes us better. I am somebody who loves reflection and who loves developing. And a lot of times, especially if I'm new, I will go into your, after I'm reviewed, I will go into your office. I will sit at your desk and say, give it to me real. What did you see? What can I do to improve? And so that's where an instructional coach is very important. A supporting and strong school culture that innovates and allows for innovation and for failure, because we learn from our failure. And then also creating a space for the parents again. And so there you go. There is that component, because if you don't have the parents and start training those parents, that's one of the things they gave parents laptops, and then they were like, all right, go. And parents are like, whoa, this is about to turn into a coaster on my table, because I don't know what to do with it. There's a certain amount of technology anxiety. And if something doesn't work out, there's this, you have to have like this built up kind of, I don't know what you call it, like a, perseverance when it comes to technology sometimes, so that you're not shaken when something doesn't go your way in technology. So if parents had more information, and I've heard of having, different times where schools actually had trainings. Schools actually went out and helped parents with their technology. They saw which way was best for their technology. Sometimes it was text, so making sure that they had the apps downloaded on their phones correctly so they can get to their Teams meetings and etc. That is an important skill to have and for administrators to implement. Go ahead.
But what you're talking about, Marie, is what you're talking about is equity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like what you're talking about is, and that picture looks different in different cultural scenarios, right? I mean, I will tell you that in my son's high school, there were 30 separate and distinct languages or dialects. And I can tell you that the way that we had parent PTSA meetings was using translator. And so what you would see is like, you'd see somebody doing a presentation, right, in PowerPoint, and they choose, whichever was the most common language to do, to have subtitling, right? Because we can do that live. And then you'd see every other parent with their cell phone, right? Because they've got the translator app open. And now suddenly, like, you've changed school culture because everyone can participate. And so when you talk about equity and accessibility, and accessibility is different than access, we know that, right? Like they're different. But like when you can have a portfolio of products that support neurodiverse kids, kids who are hard of hearing, kids who are low vision or colorblind, like all of these things, by the way. And like, I don't want to sound like a used car salesman, but I think it's important. Like all of those things are built into the technology and they're free, right? Like I never knew how to use the Windows, like ease of access functions in my own freaking machine to help my own family, right? And I work at the company. So we need to do a better job of making sure that everybody who is in a position to support a student or support an educator has, the baseline tools that they need to help make their job a little bit easier. One of the things that I worked on with Marie is we had a really fantastic sway that was built for Microsoft that had all of our accessibility features, because as you know, we have a pretty thriving disability community at Microsoft and a lot of supports. And so we had this really great sway, but half of them were tools that you would just never use in education. And so one of the resources that Chris is dropping in, thank you so much, is that sway that we edufied so that an educator can pick that up and, sway is super easy, and there's like one link per thing. I'm not going to, we're not like overloading you with lots of links and choices and things like that, but there's one link. Go and take a 20-minute course or or watch a 5-minute video on how immersive reader works. And I can tell you, like, you will never go back to doing it the way you did it before. So, it's like, it's iterative. And we're working hard to not just build those tools, but to really listen to the community and understand what they need and then provide those tools. I know we only have a few minutes left. Marie has done quite a bit of work in the area of having really deep, hard cultural conversations in the classroom. This is something that, when we were all isolated during the pandemic and, we were at sort of, Me Too and Black Lives Matter and so many things, cultural things that were happening in our community. And we're all sitting at home afraid to go to a march because we don't want to get COVID and all of these things, right? And one of the things that that we uncovered in the same study that we did last year was the fact that it's not that educators are afraid of these conversations. It's not even that they don't want to have them. They just don't know how. And that's another area where we're building supports and content and things like that to really help those instructional coaches and leaders be better in all of those areas, not just, the 4 R's. So, right. Marie.
Yeah, definitely. And I know I do definitely want to leave space for questioning, but culturally responsive pedagogy is huge, and really making sure that every student is seen, not only for their culture, but for who they are. And when we're looking at their abilities and gifts, learning how to magnify those within the classroom. And I really appreciate Microsoft taking time to even build curriculum within Minecraft. Our John Lewis, what was it called again, Sam? Please give me.
It was the John Lewis, I think it was like the John Lewis experience or something like that. Mindful Night is another one in Minecraft, right?
Yes, Mindful Night is really about that social emotional skill, and these are all things that are built so that we can have that integration that we were talking about before. It's nothing different. It is nothing outside of what we need to do on a regular basis, but to make sure that each and every single student is seen, heard, that their gifts are amplified, and that their student voice is heard and taken to another level. And I know we didn't talk too much about assessment, but that does play into our assessment and how we are assessing students as well, and making sure that students have a choice in the type of assessments and how they want to demonstrate mastery of learning and their knowledge. And a Flipgrid can do that. Also in Microsoft Teams, OneNote Notebook, and that's what I use it for, as an online digital portfolio. And so not only can we have our notes and all of our tasks, but you can add your presentations, you can add your voice recordings. All of these things are in one area, OneNote Notebook. So yeah, I mean, this is where we are going, and so I'm so excited to see what the future brings for us and how we can do it bigger, better, and faster for these kids, because it's definitely needed for our future.
Well, I'll tell you, it's not often that I have a conversation where we're talking about these difficult subjects in a difficult time and come away with a better feeling about things than when I went into them. But this conversation certainly has been that. And yeah, you're right, we are getting close to the top of the hour and the end of our conversation. I know the most difficult part of my job today was to end it. But let me finish off by asking you each just kind of a one more glass half full question, just about where you see the horizon in the next, say, 3 to 5 years. Hopefully we're going to be entering AP after the pandemic. Things will go back to normal, whatever that is. Maybe we've adopted a lot of these innovations when we went fully remote and hybrid, and maybe we can keep those around. Marie, we'll start with you. Talk a little bit about where you see that future going, all things being equal and inclusive. How do we get to that next step?
Well, number one, I love how you said back to normal, because I don't want it to be normal. Yeah. I want to continue to disrupt the system, disrupt specific things that are happening within education, and specifically as it relates to technology and how we use. I want to be as disruptive as the UC system saying no more SAT. And the reason why is because for 20 years, they have already known that SAT has been built upon eugenics, right? And so this goes back to that assessment piece of how are we assessing students? You cannot get to the deeper levels of knowledge that each and every student has just by doing ABCD test. It just doesn't work. And so providing different ways for students to really share their knowledge is going to be huge and important. And that's what's going to bring a lot of equity into the future, because these kids are a lot more than just a test. And how we use data in schools. Insights can help us with that. And I think you touched on that too, Sam. Insights can help us with how we are using data differently in schools, new ways to use data to see our students as a whole being of knowledge, past and present. And so we can help support them through the use of social emotional learning and an inclusive classroom, through the support of excellent cultural responsive pedagogy, to validate and honor who they are as people in their culture, and also to validate or also to use technology to extend their voice, amplify their voices, and amplify the deeper learning opportunities that we have as schools, and so that our students can reach their goals in life. And that's what Microsoft's talking about when they say achieve more. Yeah.
That's great,
So,
Marie. Yeah, go ahead, Sam.
I mean, we all want for our kid to have Marie as a teacher now.
I was going to say, let's clone Marie as the solution, but
you know, I mean, I have often said that, Kevin. And by the way, her husband Charles, who is also an educator, a PhD, a leader, is maybe as brilliant as well. And so there are these amazing educators who really are trying to change the system. And, you know, we've been a little behind in the US. There's other places around the world that are, you know, maybe because of different circumstances are further ahead in different places. I think the thing that I would sort of leave you with is that I feel like in the next 3 to 5 years, what will happen is it won't be about every kid having a device, right? That's, you know, when I'm so old that when I started the company started at the company a long time ago, we were still doing where do you want to go today? And there was this edict from Bill Gates about having a PC on every desktop in every home. That was where we were in the late 80s. I'll remind you. And, you know, we hit probably hyperdrive on technology in the last 20 months, being able to do things that we never thought we would be able to do before. We, as a company, created an entire operating system in remote. That's insane. Like, that's insane. So, you know, the possibilities and what we have available to us, that's endless. I think the thing that we as like sort of stewards of this work in education is really all about remembering that at the center of all of that is that student, you know, and it really just takes that one teacher like Marie, who is going to be the one that is going to either encourage them to be great and believe in themselves or not. So, you know, we do have tools that support and that help, but at the end of the day, it's really about like reaching every one of those students and really making them believe that they can succeed and achieve. And we haven't had that in lots of pockets across the US. And so in 3 to 5 years, like, I mean, I was just having this conversation with a friend of mine. I could never get into the college that I went to today. Like, I didn't do that great on my tests, but they just weren't that important then.
Yeah.
Right. And so I always thought I was kind of okay smart, right? You know, my daughter, who couldn't read the word of the day in first grade, carries a stigma with her that she's not smart. She's a very good ballet dancer, but not smart. And so that is unfair, right? And so we want to make sure that at the end of the day, we make sure that educators are supported, that school leaders have the tools that they need, the insights that they need to help them grow their school communities, to understand how their community thrives and succeeds. And then for us to underpin all of that with stuff that makes it easier, that just makes it easier for all of them to be able to do this, because an educator's job is already too hard.
Absolutely.
So that's my
that's
my thought.
a great way to end it. So I see our time is just about up, so I'm going to wrap things up here. I'd like to thank both Marie and Sam for a really informative presentation, and I'd like to thank all of the audience members for joining us as well. As a reminder, you'll get an email within the next few days that contains a link to this recording along with the slides. Thanks again for participating, and have a great day. Bye, guys. Thanks.